The sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Hangtown, California, as Zoe Hargrove clutched her threadbare shawl tightly around her shoulders. The year was 1876, and the mining town, once flush with gold and promise, had fallen on harder times, much like Zoe herself. She watched with hollow eyes as her father, drunk and desperate, shook hands with Franklin Pierce, the wealthiest banker in 3 counties. The deal was done. She had been sold to settle a debt she hadn't even known existed until this morning. 21 years I kept you fed, her father had slurred when she protested. Now you can return the favor. The banker's son, Theodore Pierce, stood beside his father, eyeing Zoe like she was a prized mare at auction. At 32, Theodore was 11 years her senior, with cold eyes and immaculately manicured fingernails that had never seen a day of honest labor. "You'll marry my son within the week," Franklin Pierce announced, his voice carrying down the street. "The debt will be forgiven, and you'll have a position in society most girls would kill for." Zoe felt her world collapse around her. She had dreams foolish perhaps of love and adventure, not of becoming the property of a man who viewed her as nothing more than a transaction. From the shadows of the livery stable across the street, Mason Quinn watched the scene unfold. His weathered hat pulled low, his hand resting on the worn grip of his Colt. At 25, Mason had seen more than his share of injustice in the untamed territories. He'd been working as a ranch hand at the Broken Spoke Ranch outside of town for 3 years now, saving every penny, dreaming of his own spread someday. He recognized Zoe from the times he'd come into town for supplies. She worked at Harrigan's General Store, always with a kind word and a genuine smile that reached her eyes that now stared vacantly as her future was bartered away by a father who didn't deserve the title. "She ain't cattle to be traded," Mason muttered to himself, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. His boss, Tom Everett, stood beside him, loading supplies into their wagon. "Ain't our business, Quinn," Everett cautioned. "Pierce runs this town now, got the mayor and sheriff in his pocket." Mason's jaw tightened. "Doesn't make it right." 2 days later, Zoe stood behind the counter at Harrigan's, mechanically stocking shelves. The bell above the door jingled, and she looked up to see Mason Quinn entering, removing his hat as he did. "Afternoon, Miss Hargrove," he said, nodding politely. "Mr. Quinn," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What can I help you with today?" Mason approached the counter, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. "Need some coffee, sugar," and he paused, lowering his voice. "Wanted to make sure you were all right. Saw what happened the other day." Zoe's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the coffee. "It's kind of you to ask, but there's nothing to be done. The wedding is set for Sunday." "There's always something to be done," Mason replied, his voice steady and sure. "No one should be forced to marry against their will." Zoe looked up sharply. "My father owes the Pierces over $2,000. Money he gambled away while I was working here thinking we were just getting by." Her voice cracked. "He signed papers. If I don't marry Theodore, we'll lose everything. Not that we have much to lose." Mason leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if someone paid that debt?" A bitter laugh escaped Zoe's lips. "Who would do such a thing, and why?" "I've been saving," Mason said simply. "Not quite that much, but close. And as for why," he met her eyes directly, "because it ain't right what they're doing to you." For the first time in days, a flicker of hope sparked in Zoe's chest, but she quickly extinguished it. "I can't let you do that. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Mason replied. "I know you're the only person in this town who remembers to ask after my mama's health when I mention her being sick. I know you slip extra candy to the orphans from the mission when they come in, and I know you deserve better than to be traded like property." Tears welled in Zoe's eyes. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Mason agreed. "But I'm willing to try if you are." Before Zoe could respond, the bell jingled again. Theodore Pierce entered, flanked by 2 men his father's personal guards who doubled as debt collectors. Mason stepped back from the counter, tipping his hat politely. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pierce," Zoe said mechanically. Theodore barely acknowledged her, his eyes fixed on Mason. "Quinn, isn't it? You work for Tom Everett." "That's right," Mason replied evenly. Theodore smirked. "My father just bought the mortgage on Everett's ranch. Seems he's been having trouble making payments. Shame if all his hands found themselves without work." The threat was clear. Mason's expression hardened, but he kept his voice level. "Appreciate the information, Mr. Pierce. I'll be on my way." As Mason paid for his supplies, his fingers brushed against Zoe's. She felt a small piece of paper pressed into her palm. Their eyes met briefly before he turned and left the store. That night, alone in the small room behind the general store that Mr. Harrigan let her use in exchange for opening the shop early and closing late, Zoe unfolded the note. "Midnight. The old oak by Willow Creek. If you want a choice." Her heart pounded. It was madness to even consider it. Yet the thought of becoming Theodore Pierce's wife, of enduring his cold touch and colder heart for the rest of her life, was unbearable. She had seen the way he treated the working girls at the Silver Slipper Saloon, with contempt thinly veiled as generosity. As the town clock struck 11, Zoe made her decision. She packed a small bag with her meager belongings, left a note for Mr. Harrigan apologizing for her sudden departure, and slipped out the back door into the cool night air. The old oak stood sentinel by Willow Creek, its massive branches spread like protective arms against the star-filled sky. As Zoe approached, a figure detached itself from the shadows. Mason Quinn stood beside a saddled horse, leading another by the reins. "Wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. "Neither was I," Zoe admitted, clutching her small bag. "This is crazy. They'll come after us." "Probably," Mason agreed. "But I've got friends in Colorado. We can make it if we ride hard." Zoe hesitated. "Why are you doing this truly? What do you want from me?" Mason's eyes, visible in the moonlight, held no guile. "Nothing you don't freely give. I want you to have a choice, Miss Hargrove. That's all." "Call me Zoe," she said. "If we're to be fugitives together, we might as well use first names." A smile tugged at the corner of Mason's mouth. "Zoe, then. And I'm Mason." He helped her mount the mare he'd brought, a steady sorrel with a white blaze. "She's gentle but has good stamina. We'll need to ride through the night." As they set off, Zoe cast one last glance at Hangtown, the only home she'd ever known. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the strange, unsettling company of a man she barely knew, but who had risked everything to give her something no one else had: a choice. The first pink tendrils of dawn were stretching across the eastern sky when Mason finally called a halt. They had ridden through the night, following game trails and creek beds to avoid the main roads. "We need to rest the horses," he explained, dismounting stiffly. "There's a spot up ahead where we can make camp for a few hours." Zoe nodded, too exhausted to speak. Her legs trembled as Mason helped her down from the saddle. She had ridden before, but never through an entire night at such a pace. The spot Mason led them to was a small clearing beside a narrow stream, sheltered by a rocky overhang. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but it's hidden from the trail. I've used it before." "It's perfect," Zoe said, sinking gratefully onto a flat rock while Mason tended to the horses. When he'd finished, he brought out jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. "Not exactly a feast," he said, offering her a share. "I'm grateful for it," Zoe replied, suddenly ravenous. They ate in silence for a few minutes before she spoke again. "You mentioned Colorado. Do you have family there?" Mason nodded. "My older brother has a place near Denver. Started as a ranch hand, saved up, now has his own spread. Not big, but it's his." A trace of pride colored his voice. "Michael's always said there's a place for me there when I'm ready." "And are you? Ready, I mean?" Mason considered the question. "Been saying I needed more money first. Truth is, maybe I was just scared to make the leap." He looked at her directly. Guess it took something more important to make me act. Zoe felt warmth rise in her cheeks. I still don't understand why you're doing this. My pa was a lot like yours, Mason said after a moment, drank away whatever we had, sold my ma's wedding ring once for gambling money. His jaw tightened at the memory. I was 14 when I saw him trade my sister's future to settle a debt. She was 16, married her off to a man 3 times her age. What happened to her? Zoe asked softly. Died in childbirth a year later. Mason's voice was flat, controlled. I swore I'd never stand by and watch that happen again if I could help it. Zoe reached out, briefly touching his hand. I'm sorry about your sister, and I'm grateful to you, though you're risking so much. We should get some sleep, Mason said, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. I'll take first watch. We'll move on in a few hours. Zoe nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Using her bag as a pillow, she lay down on the softest patch of ground she could find and was asleep almost instantly. When she awoke, the sun was high overhead. Mason sat a few feet away, cleaning his revolver with practiced ease. You let me sleep too long, she said, sitting up and pushing hair from her face. You needed it, he replied simply. Besides, no sign of pursuit yet. You think they're coming? Mason nodded grimly. Theodore Pierce isn't the type to let go of what he considers his property, and your father's debt gives him legal standing. Question is whether they can pick up our trail. Zoe's stomach tightened with fear. How far to Colorado? At this pace, about 10 days. Mason reassembled his revolver with swift, sure movements. But we can't keep riding cross-country the whole way. We'll need supplies and the horses need proper rest. So we'll have to risk towns? Small ones, where news travels slower. Mason stood and offered her his canteen. There's a place called Liberty about 2 days from here. Friend of mine runs the livery there. We can resupply and maybe get word about whether there's a posse after us. They broke camp quickly. As Zoe gathered her few belongings, Mason approached with something in his hand. Almost forgot. Got this for you before we left. He held out a small revolver. Smith & Wesson, 5 shots. It's loaded. Zoe stared at the weapon. I don't know how to use it. I'll teach you. Basic rule is point and pull the trigger, but there's more to it if you want to actually hit what you're aiming at. A hint of a smile crossed his face. Figure every woman should know how to protect herself, especially out here. Zoe took the revolver gingerly. It was heavier than it looked. Thank you. They rode hard for the rest of the day, Mason setting a pace that was demanding but not punishing for the horses. As the sun began to set, he spotted a suitable camping place, a dense copse of trees near a bend in a small river. After they had made camp and eaten, Mason took Zoe to a clearing and showed her how to hold the revolver, how to aim, and how to account for the kick when firing. Don't waste bullets practicing now, he advised. Sound carries, and we don't need to advertise our location, but when we get somewhere safer, you'll get to try it out. That night, as they sat beside a small, carefully banked fire, Zoe finally asked the question that had been on her mind. What happens when we reach Colorado? What's your plan? Mason poked at the fire with a stick. My brother will help us. You can stay there until you decide what you want to do. Denver's a big city, plenty of opportunities for a woman with skills. And you? He shrugged. Maybe finally take Michael up on his offer. Start building something of my own. Zoe studied him in the firelight. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged exterior. You know, for someone who barely knows me, you've upended your entire life. Some things are worth upending your life for, he replied simply, then stood. Get some sleep. I'll take first watch again. As Zoe lay wrapped in the blanket Mason had given her, she found herself wondering what kind of man did something so extraordinary for a virtual stranger. And why, despite the danger and uncertainty of their situation, she felt safer than she had in years. The next day brought a new challenge. As they were breaking camp, Mason froze, listening intently. Riders, he said quietly, coming from the west. Zoe's heart raced. Pierce's men? Can't tell, but we shouldn't take chances. Mason quickly scattered the remains of their fire and erased as many signs of their camp as possible. Mount up. We'll head east through the trees. Try to stay out of sight. They rode in tense silence, Mason frequently stopping to listen. The sound of hoofbeats grew fainter, then disappeared entirely. I think we're clear, he said finally, but we should avoid the route I had planned. They might be checking all the obvious trails to Liberty. So what do we do? Mason considered for a moment. There's a place called Copper Creek about a day southeast of here, smaller than Liberty, not as friendly to strangers, but we might be able to resupply there without being noticed. The detour added miles to their journey. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered and a chill wind picked up. Storm coming, Mason observed grimly. We need to find shelter before it hits. They pushed on, the sky growing increasingly ominous. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Mason spotted an abandoned line shack nestled against a hillside. Might not be much, but it'll keep us dry, he said, leading them toward it. The shack was small and weathered, but still had its roof mostly intact. Inside was a rusty stove, a rickety table, and a single narrow cot with a straw mattress. Home sweet home, Mason said with a wry smile as thunder boomed outside. He managed to get the stove working with the small supply of dry wood stacked beside it, while Zoe shook out the dusty blanket from the cot. You should take the cot, Mason said, spreading his bedroll on the floor. We could share it, Zoe suggested, then blushed furiously at his startled expression. I mean, take turns. It's not fair for you to sleep on the floor every night. Mason's face relaxed into a small smile. I've slept on worse than this floor, believe me. You take the cot. As the storm raged outside, they shared a meager dinner of jerky and the last of their hardtack. The warmth of the stove and the sound of the rain created an unexpectedly cozy atmosphere. Tell me about yourself, Mason said as they sat close to the stove. More than just what I've seen in town? Zoe hugged her knees to her chest. Not much to tell. My mother died when I was 12. Fever. After that, it was just my father and me. He wasn't always, she hesitated, like he is now. The drinking got worse over time. You've worked at Harrigan's for a while? She nodded. 5 years. Started when I was 16. Mr. Harrigan's been kind to me. Let me have the room in the back when things got too bad at home. You're good with numbers, Mason observed. I've seen you calculating tallies faster than most men could. Zoe looked surprised. You notice that? I notice a lot of things, he said quietly. Like how you're the only person in that store who can calm down old Mrs. Leary when she gets confused about her purchases. A smile tugged at Zoe's lips. She just needs patience. Her mind wanders, but she's sweet. What would you have done? Mason asked suddenly. If life had been different, if you'd had choices. Zoe was silent for a long moment. I've always wanted to teach, she finally admitted. I love books, learning. Hangtown has no proper school. Children there grow up barely able to read. Her voice grew passionate. I think education changes lives, opens doors. Mason watched her, a new appreciation in his eyes. You'd make a fine teacher. It was just a dream, Zoe said, embarrassment creeping into her voice. Silly, probably. Not silly at all, Mason replied seriously. Dreams keep us going when nothing else does. The storm continued through the night, rain pounding on the roof and wind howling around the corners of the shack. Despite the noise, Zoe slept soundly, feeling oddly secure with Mason's presence nearby. She awoke to the smell of coffee. Mason had the stove going and was heating water in a battered pot he'd found in the shack. It's not fresh ground, he apologized, but it's hot. Zoe accepted the tin cup gratefully. The storm's passed? Mason nodded. Cleared about an hour ago, but the trails will be muddy. We'll need to take it slower today. They set out after a brief breakfast, the world around them washed clean by the storm. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and birds called from the trees. By mid-morning, Mason had grown increasingly alert, frequently checking their back trail. Is something wrong? Zoe asked, noticing his tension. Not sure, he replied, scanning the horizon. Just a feeling, like we're being watched. Around noon, as they paused to rest the horses by a small stream, the crack of a rifle shot split the air. Mason reacted instantly, grabbing Zoe and pulling her off her horse and behind a large boulder. Stay down, he ordered, drawing his revolver. Another shot rang out, splintering bark from a tree near their heads. Mason peered carefully around the edge of the boulder. 2 riders, he reported grimly, about 200 yards back. They've got rifles. Pierce's men? Zoe asked, her voice shaking. Likely, or bounty hunters he's hired. Mason checked his ammunition. We need to move. The horses are too exposed. He whistled sharply, and remarkably, both horses trotted toward their shelter, staying low as if they understood the danger. Good girl, Mason murmured to his mount. Zoe, we're going to mount up and make a run for those trees. He pointed to a dense stand of pines about 50 yards away. I'll cover you. When I say go, you ride hard and don't look back. I'm not leaving you, Zoe protested. You're not. I'll be right behind you. But one of us needs to get to cover first, and you're the smaller target. Another shot kicked up dirt near them. Mason returned fire, squeezing off 2 careful shots that sent their pursuers diving for cover. Now, he shouted. Heart in her throat, Zoe swung into the saddle and urged her mare forward, bent low over the horse's neck. The animal seemed to sense the urgency and burst into a gallop. Shots rang out behind her, but none came close. She reached the trees and wheeled around just in time to see Mason mounting his horse in one fluid motion. He fired once more toward their attackers, then spurred his horse toward her. More shots followed him, but he reached the trees safely. Without pausing, he motioned for her to follow him deeper into the forest. They rode hard for nearly an hour, following game trails and stream beds to obscure their trail. Finally, when the horses were lathered and breathing hard, Mason called a halt in a small clearing. I think we've lost them for now, he said, dismounting, but they'll keep coming. Zoe slid from her saddle on shaky legs. The reality of being shot at had finally sunk in. They really mean to kill us? Kill me, maybe. Take you back, definitely. Mason unsaddled the horses to let them cool properly. Pierce doesn't like losing what he considers his property. Zoe wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the midday sun filtering through the trees. This is my fault. You should never have gotten involved. Mason looked at her sharply. None of this is your fault. The only people to blame are your father for selling you and Pierce for thinking he could buy you. But now your life is in danger because of me. He stepped closer, his expression softening. My life is my own to risk, Zoe. I made my choice. There was something in the way he said it, something in his eyes that made Zoe's heart beat faster. For a moment she thought he might reach for her, but he turned away, busying himself with checking the horses. Copper Creek is still a few hours' ride, he said, his voice carefully neutral. We'll have to be extra cautious now. They know we're headed east. They continued their journey, taking a circuitous route that added miles, but kept them under the cover of trees as much as possible. By late afternoon, they caught sight of Copper Creek, a ramshackle collection of buildings that made Hangtown look positively metropolitan. Not much to look at, Mason admitted, but there's a general store and a stable. We'll go in separately. Less likely to be noticed that way. What if someone recognizes us? News travels slow out here, and Pierce's influence doesn't extend this far. But keep your head down just in case. Mason handed her some money. Get whatever supplies you think we need. I'll see about fresh horses. Ours need a proper rest after today. They approached the town from different directions. Zoe entered the general store, heart pounding, but the elderly shopkeeper barely glanced at her. She quickly purchased coffee, beans, salt pork, and other staples they would need for the journey ahead. She was just leaving the store when a weathered poster tacked to a board outside caught her eye. It showed crude sketches of 2 figures, a man and a woman with the words "Wanted" emblazoned across the top. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the descriptions of herself and Mason. Reward: $500 for information leading to the capture of Mason Quinn and the return of Zoe Hargrove to Hangtown, California. Quinn wanted for kidnapping and theft. Approach with caution, armed and dangerous. Zoe hurried toward the stable where Mason had gone, clutching her purchases tightly. She found him negotiating with the stable owner for 2 fresh horses. "Mason," she whispered urgently when the owner stepped away to check on the horses. "There are wanted posters with our names." Mason's expression darkened. "Damn, they're moving faster than I expected. We need to leave now." The stable owner returned, leading 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding and a dappled gray mare. "These 2 will get you where you're going," he said. $15 for the pair. Mason counted out the money, trying to appear casual. "Much obliged. My wife and I need to make good time to her sister's place near Santa Fe. Baby coming any day now." The man nodded, seemingly uninterested in their story. But as they were saddling the fresh horses, Zoe noticed him studying them more carefully, his eyes narrowing. "We need to hurry," she whispered to Mason. They were just mounting up when the stable owner emerged from the back room with a shotgun in his hands. "You 2 match the description on that poster in town," he said, leveling the weapon at them. $500 is a lot of money." Mason's hand hovered near his revolver. "You're making a mistake, mister. We're just passing through." "Then you won't mind waiting until the sheriff gets back tomorrow," the man replied. "He can sort it out." "We can't wait that long," Mason said, his voice hardening. "My wife's sister needs us." The stable owner's eyes flicked to Zoe. "That ain't your wife, Quinn. That's the Hargrove girl from Hangtown. Poster says you kidnapped her." "He didn't kidnap me," Zoe said firmly, finding her voice. "I left of my own free will." "Not what the poster says," the man insisted. "Now both of you get down from those horses." What happened next occurred so quickly, Zoe barely had time to register it. Mason moved like lightning, drawing his revolver even as he kicked his horse forward. The stable owner fired, but the shot went wild as Mason's horse knocked into him. The shotgun clattered to the ground. "Ride, Zoe!" Mason shouted, wheeling his horse around. She dug her heels into her mount's sides, and the gray mare bolted from the stable. Mason was right behind her, firing a shot over his shoulder that kicked up dirt at the stable owner's feet, causing him to dive for cover. They thundered out of town, pushing the fresh horses hard until they were well clear of Copper Creek. Only then did Mason call a halt, leading them into a dense thicket where they would be hidden from the trail. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Zoe nodded, still shaken. "He was going to turn us in." $500 is more money than he'd see in a year," Mason said grimly. "Can't entirely blame him." "The poster said you were wanted for kidnapping and theft. What did you supposedly steal?" Mason's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "You, I expect. In Pierce's mind, your property he paid for." The casual cruelty of it made Zoe's stomach turn. "So now we're both outlaws." "Seems that way." Mason checked their supplies. "Did you get everything we needed?" Zoe nodded, showing him the provisions she'd purchased. "Good. We'll avoid towns completely now. I know some trails that'll keep us away from settlements." As they made camp that night, deeper in the wilderness than they had yet ventured, Zoe found herself watching Mason covertly. Despite everything, she felt safe with him, safer than she'd felt in years. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Helping me?" Mason looked up from the small fire he was tending. "Not for a second." "Even though you're now wanted, your reputation ruined?" He shrugged. "My reputation was never worth much anyway. As for being wanted," his eyes met hers across the fire, "some things are worth the risk." The way he looked at her made something flutter in Zoe's chest. There was admiration there, yes, but something more, something that made her cheeks warm and her pulse quicken. "We should reach the Colorado border in about 5 days if we're lucky," Mason said, breaking the moment. "My brother's place is another 3 days' ride from there." "And you're sure he'll help us?" "Even with you being wanted now?" Mason nodded confidently. "Michael's not one to turn away family, and he's no friend of men who think they can buy and sell people." That night, as they lay beside the fire, closer to each other than they had been on previous nights, due to the colder mountain air, Zoe found herself studying Mason's profile in the firelight. Tell me about your dreams, she said softly. You know mine now. Mason was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Always wanted land of my own, he finally said. Not a huge spread, just enough to raise some cattle, maybe horses. A place where the work I do benefits me, not someone else. He paused. A home. That sounds wonderful, Zoe murmured. Mason turned his head to look at her. What about you? Still want to be a teacher? Yes, she said without hesitation. More than ever now, to be independent, to help others find their own way. You will, he said with quiet conviction. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Zoe Hargrove. She laughed softly. Me? I'm not strong. I was going to marry Theodore Pierce because I was too afraid to do anything else until you came along. That's not true. You made the choice to leave with me, a virtual stranger, into the unknown. That takes courage most men don't have. The sincerity in his voice warmed something deep inside her. Thank you, Mason, she whispered, for everything. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Zoe felt a shift between them, subtle but unmistakable. Mason seemed to feel it too, for he cleared his throat and looked away. We should get some sleep, he said, his voice slightly rough. Long day tomorrow. Dawn broke clear and cold the next morning. They set out early, Mason leading them up into higher country where the trees grew denser and the trails narrower. Less chance of running into anyone up here, he explained. Hunting is better too. That afternoon, Mason brought down a young deer with a clean shot. They made camp early so he could dress the meat and smoke some of it for the journey ahead. As Zoe watched him work with practiced efficiency, she found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet, capable man who had risked everything for her. There was a depth to Mason Quinn that she had never encountered before, steadfast integrity that went bone deep. Where did you learn all this? She asked, gesturing to the way he was preparing the meat. How to survive out here? Mason glanced up. Some from my pa, before the drink took him. More from necessity afterward. Worked as a trapper for a while in Montana Territory. Hard life. But you learn fast or you don't survive. You've lived quite a life for someone so young. He gave a short laugh. 25 ain't that young out here. Still, Zoe persisted, you've seen so much, done so much. Not always good things, Mason admitted, his expression sobering. Made my share of mistakes. Like what? He hesitated, then sighed. Killed a man once, bar fight in Cheyenne. He pulled a knife, I pulled my gun. Wasn't proud of it, but it was him or me. Zoe absorbed this. That's self-defense. Still weighs on a man, Mason replied quietly. Taking a life changes you. They were silent for a while as he continued his work. Finally, Zoe spoke again. I think we all have regrets. Things we wish we'd done differently. What's yours? Mason asked, genuinely curious. Not standing up to my father sooner, she said after a moment's reflection. Letting him dictate my life for so long. If I'd left earlier. You were surviving, Mason pointed out. Sometimes that's all we can do until an opportunity presents itself. Like you did for me. Mason's eyes met hers. Like we did for each other. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of riding, making camp, and growing increasingly comfortable in each other's company. Mason taught Zoe more about tracking and hunting, while she shared stories from the books she'd read, entertaining him during the long evenings by the fire. With each passing day, Zoe felt herself changing, growing stronger, more confident. The desperate young woman who had fled Hangtown was giving way to someone new, someone who looked to the future with hope rather than dread. And with that growth came an increasing awareness of Mason, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness of his calloused hands when he helped her mount her horse, the deep timbre of his voice as he spoke of his dreams. On the fourth night, as they camped beneath a canopy of stars brighter than any Zoe had ever seen, Mason announced they had crossed into Colorado territory. Another 3 days to my brother's place, he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. 4 if we're cautious. Do you think they're still looking for us? Zoe asked. Pierce isn't the type to give up easily, Mason replied honestly, but we've covered a lot of ground, and our trail's gone cold by now. As they sat beside the fire, the night air grew chill. Zoe shivered, and without comment, Mason moved closer, offering the warmth of his presence. Their shoulders touched, and neither moved away. "When we reach your brothers," Zoe said hesitantly. "What then?" Mason poked at the fire. "You'll be safe there. Can stay as long as you need to figure out your next steps." "And you?" He glanced at her. "Thought I might stay too, for a while at least. Michael's been after me to help him expand the operation." Zoe nodded, relief washing through her. The thought of parting from Mason had become increasingly difficult to contemplate. "I've been thinking," she said carefully. "Denver has schools, good ones from what I've heard." "It does," Mason agreed. "Thinking of pursuing that teaching dream?" "Maybe. Eventually." Zoe gathered her courage. "Mason, these past days—" Before she could finish, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their fire. Mason was on his feet in an instant, gun drawn. "Who's there?" he called sharply. Silence, then another crack. Mason positioned himself between Zoe and the sound. "Show yourself," he demanded. A figure emerged from the darkness, hands raised. "Easy, friend, just passing through." The man who stepped into the circle of firelight was tall and lean, with a silver-streaked beard and weathered face. He wore buckskins and carried a long rifle. "Name's Harlan Daniels," he said, keeping his hands visible. "Mountain man. Trapping up in these parts." Mason's gun remained trained on the stranger. "Kinda late to be wandering around, Daniels." The man shrugged. "Saw your fire. Been weeks since I talked to another soul. Thought I might share your camp for the night, if you're amenable." Mason studied him warily. "You alone?" "As the day I was born," Daniels replied. "Got no quarrel with you or the lady. Just seeking a bit of company and perhaps a cup of that coffee I smell." After a tense moment, Mason slowly lowered his weapon. "You can stay, but your rifle stays over there." He indicated a spot well away from where they sat. Daniels nodded agreeably, setting his rifle down where directed. He settled himself by the fire with a grateful sigh as Mason poured him coffee. "Much obliged," the mountain man said, accepting the cup. "Been up in the high country since spring, heading to Denver to sell my furs before winter sets in." "Good trapping this year?" Mason asked, still watching the man carefully. "Fair to middling. Beaver's getting scarcer." Daniels sipped his coffee appreciatively. "You two heading to Denver as well?" "Thereabouts," Mason answered noncommittally. Daniels glanced between them, a knowing look in his eye. "Running from something, if you don't mind my saying. Not that it's any of my business." "It isn't," Mason agreed evenly. The mountain man raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Meant no offense. Man's business is his own out here. That's why most of us come to the mountains in the first place." He reached into his pouch and pulled out a flask. "Bit of whiskey to return your hospitality?" Mason shook his head. "We'll stick with coffee." Daniels shrugged and took a pull from the flask himself. "Suit yourself." He studied Zoe curiously. "Not many women brave these trails. You must be something special, madam." "She is," Mason said simply, his tone discouraging further questions. They passed the rest of the evening in uneasy conversation, with Daniels sharing tales of his years in the mountains that grew increasingly outlandish as he continued to drink from his flask. When it came time to sleep, Mason insisted Daniels take the far side of the fire. He himself positioned his bedroll between the mountain man and Zoe, his revolver close at hand. "Don't trust me, eh?" Daniels observed with a chuckle. "Don't trust anyone," Mason replied. "No offense." "None taken. Smart man lives longer out here." Despite her exhaustion, Zoe found sleep elusive. The stranger's presence had disrupted the sense of intimacy that had been growing between her and Mason. She had been about to tell him something important, something she was only just beginning to understand herself. When she finally drifted off, her sleep was fitful and troubled by dreams of pursuit. She awoke before dawn to find Mason already up, rekindling the fire. Daniel still slept, snoring softly. "Everything all right?" she whispered, moving to join Mason. He nodded. "Fine. Just thinking we should get an early start." As they prepared a simple breakfast, Daniel stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, folks," he said through a yawn. "You're up with the birds." "Long way to go," Mason replied, handing him a cup of coffee. They ate quickly, the mountain man regaling them with one last tale of narrowly escaping a grizzly bear. As they packed up to leave, he gathered his own meager belongings. "Which way you headed?" Mason asked casually. Daniels gestured north. "Following Cedar Creek up to the high pass, then down toward Denver." Mason nodded, looking relieved. "We're keeping to the lower trail, easier on the horses." "Wise choice this time of year," Daniels agreed. "Well, I thank you for the hospitality." He shouldered his pack and retrieved his rifle. "Safe travels to you both. If you make it to Denver, there's a place called the Silver Dollar. Good whiskey, fair games. Ask for Harlan if you're ever in need." With that, he tipped his hat and disappeared into the trees, heading north. "Think he recognized us?" Zoe asked once he was gone. "Hard to say," Mason replied. "Mountain men don't pay much attention to the doings of town folk, but better safe than sorry. We'll alter our route a bit today." They rode south instead of east that morning, only turning back toward their original course when Mason was confident they weren't being followed. The detour cost them several hours, and by nightfall, they had made less progress than planned. "We'll make up the time tomorrow," Mason assured her as they made camp beside a small lake nestled in a valley between two ridges. "This is good country. My brother's place isn't far now, maybe 3 more days." As they sat by the fire that night, the conversation they'd nearly had before Daniel's arrival hung between them. Zoe found herself watching Mason, wondering if he felt it too, this connection that had grown between them, stronger with each passing day. "What were you going to say last night?" Mason asked suddenly. Before we were interrupted, Zoe's heart raced. "I was going to say that these days with you have changed me, that I'm not the same person who left Hangtown." Mason's eyes remained on the fire. "Changed how?" "I feel stronger, more certain of myself, like I can face whatever comes next." She paused, gathering her courage. "And I think it's because of you, because you believed in me before I believed in myself." Mason looked up then, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "You had it in you all along, Zoe. I just gave you a chance to see it." "It's more than that," she insisted softly. "You've shown me what kind of man, what kind of person I want in my life. Someone honest and brave and kind." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Mason's gaze held hers, intense and questioning. "Zoe," he began, his voice low, "I don't want you to feel obligated because of what I did." "Obligated?" she repeated, confused. "To feel something for me," he clarified, looking away, "just because I helped you." Understanding dawned, and with it came a surge of both frustration and tenderness. "Mason Quinn, do you really think I'm so easily influenced that I can't tell the difference between gratitude and—" She hesitated, then finished firmly, "and deeper feelings?" His eyes returned to hers, a flicker of hope visible in their depths. "What are you saying?" Zoe moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you, not because you rescued me, but because of who you are. Because every day with you shows me something new to admire." For a long moment, Mason was perfectly still. Then, slowly, he raised his hand to her cheek, his calloused fingers infinitely gentle against her skin. "I've been falling since the moment you stepped onto that horse in Hangtown," he admitted quietly. "Tried to tell myself it was just protectiveness, that you deserved better than an almost outlaw with nothing to his name." "I don't want better," Zoe whispered. "I want you." The space between them vanished as Mason's lips found hers, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, and Zoe felt as though something long missing had finally slotted into place. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Zoe Hargrove," he murmured, "have since before I even knew it." "And I love you, Mason Quinn," she replied, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." He nodded, a smile spreading across his face that transformed him, erasing the worry lines that had been his constant companion since Hangtown. "Together," he agreed. That night, they slept side by side, closer than before, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm protectively around her. Despite the uncertainty that still lay ahead, Zoe had never felt more at peace. The next morning dawned clear and bright. They set out with renewed energy, the mountains rising majestically before them as they rode east. Mason pointed out landmarks, growing more animated as they entered territory he knew well. "See that peak there? That's Settler's Mountain. My brother's place lies in the valley beyond it. Another 2 days' ride." Zoe could feel his excitement and shared it. The prospect of safety, of a place to rest and plan their future together, was tantalizing after days on the run. They made good time that day, pushing the horses a bit harder now that the end of their journey was in sight. As evening approached, Mason led them to a sheltered spot beside a rushing stream. "This is one of my favorite places," he told her as they made camp. "Used to come here sometimes when I needed to think." After they had eaten, Mason took her hand. "Come on, there's something I want to show you." He led her a short distance upstream to where the creek widened into a deep pool. The last rays of the setting sun turned the water to liquid gold. "It's beautiful," Zoe breathed. "Wait," Mason said with a smile. As the light faded, something magical happened. Hundreds of fireflies emerged from the surrounding trees, their tiny lights reflecting in the still water of the pool. Zoe gasped in delight. "I've never seen so many." Mason's eyes were on her face, not the fireflies. "I used to think this was the most beautiful sight in Colorado," he said softly. "Now I know better." Zoe turned to him, her heart full. Without words, she reached for him, and they came together in a kiss that spoke of all they had endured and all they hoped for. Later, as they lay beside their fire, making plans for the future, Mason suddenly sat up, alert. "What is it?" Zoe asked, instantly tense. "Horses," he said, reaching for his gun. "More than 2, coming this way." Zoe's blood ran cold. "Pierce's men?" "Could be," Mason said grimly, getting to his feet. "Or just travelers. Either way, we should—" He never finished the sentence. The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the trees, and a bullet thudded into the log beside them. "Get down!" Mason shouted, pulling Zoe behind the shelter of a large boulder. More shots followed, kicking up dirt around them. Mason returned fire, his revolver barking twice in the growing darkness. "How many?" Zoe gasped, pressing herself against the rock. "Can't tell, at least 3, Mason replied, checking his ammunition. "They've got us pinned down." A voice called from the trees. "Quinn, we know you're there. Send out the girl and maybe you walk away from this." Mason's jaw tightened. "Pierce's men, all right." "What do we do?" Zoe whispered, fear clawing at her throat. Mason's mind raced. "The horses are behind us, down by the creek, if we can reach them." Another volley of shots interrupted him, closer this time. Their attackers were advancing. "Quinn!" the voice called again. "Pierce is offering $1,000 now, double the original reward. All you have to do is walk away." "He can keep his money!" Mason shouted back. "The lady isn't for sale." His defiance was met with derisive laughter. "Have it your way. We'll take her back anyway, and you'll be buzzard food." In the brief lull that followed, Mason turned to Zoe, his expression fierce in the fading firelight. "Listen to me. I'm going to create a diversion. When I do, you run for the horses. Follow the creek downstream. It leads to a trail that will take you to my brother's place." "I'm not leaving you," Zoe protested. "You have to," Mason insisted. "I'll be right behind you. But one of us needs to get clear first." Before she could argue further, Mason surged to his feet, firing rapidly in the direction of their attackers. "Go!" he shouted. "Now!" Hard in her throat, Zoe ran, bent low, toward where their horses were tethered. Behind her, she heard the continued exchange of gunfire, punctuated by shouts and curses. She reached the horses, fumbling with the reins in the darkness. The animals were skittish from the gunfire, eyes rolling with fear. She managed to mount her gray mare, but as she reached for Mason's horse, more shots rang out, closer than before. The bay gelding reared, yanking its reins free, and bolted into the darkness. Zoe hesitated, torn between following Mason's instructions and going back for him. The decision was made for her when she heard his voice, urgent and strained. "Ride, Zoe. Go!" She kicked her horse into motion, following the creek as Mason had instructed. Tears blurred her vision as she rode, the sound of gunfire growing fainter behind her. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she knew Mason was right. One of them needed to get away to have any chance at all. She rode hard for what seemed like hours, following the creek as it wound through the darkened landscape. Eventually, the sound of pursuit faded entirely, and she slowed her exhausted horse to a walk. The moon had risen, casting enough light to see the trail Mason had mentioned. It wound through a narrow pass between towering cliffs, a perfect bottleneck where one person could hold off many. Zoe stopped, torn with indecision. Should she continue to Mason's brother's ranch and bring help, or return to find out what had happened to Mason? As she debated, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached her. Someone was coming along the trail behind her. Friend or foe, she couldn't be sure. Quickly, she guided her horse off the trail into a dense thicket, heart pounding as she waited. The rider approached slowly, clearly following her trail even in the darkness. Zoe held her breath, one hand on the small revolver Mason had given her. The figure that emerged into the moonlight was slumped in the saddle, riding a horse she didn't recognize. For a moment, fear gripped her. Then the rider raised his head, and moonlight illuminated a familiar face. "Mason!" she cried, urging her horse out of hiding. He turned toward her voice, relief washing over his features. "Zoe. Thank God." As she drew closer, she saw the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. "You're hurt." "Just a graze," he assured her, though the tightness in his voice belied his words. "Lost my horse in the chaos. Had to acquire this one from one of our friends." "The men who attacked us?" Mason's expression was grim. "They won't be following. 2 down for certain. The 3rd ran." Zoe didn't ask for details. The haunted look in Mason's eyes told her enough. "We need to get you to your brother's. Can you stay in the saddle?" He nodded. "I'll make it." Trail follows the creek for another 5 miles, then cuts east through a stand of pines. Michael's place is in the valley beyond. They rode through the night, Zoe constantly checking on Mason. His face grew increasingly pale in the moonlight, and more than once she had to steady him when he swayed in the saddle. Dawn was breaking when they finally crested a ridge and looked down into a beautiful valley. A substantial log house stood beside a barn and corral, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. "That's it," Mason said, his voice weak but triumphant. "My brother's place." They had barely started down the slope when a rider emerged from the tree line below, rifle raised. He approached cautiously, then suddenly spurred his horse forward. "Mason!" the man called, disbelief and joy mingling in his voice. "Mason Quinn! Is that you?" "Hello, Michael," Mason replied with a weary smile. "Hope you got room for visitors." Michael Quinn was an older version of his brother, same strong jaw and thoughtful eyes, though his hair was darker and he wore a full beard. He took in Mason's bloodied shirt and Zoe's exhausted state with a quick glance. "What kind of trouble have you brought to my doorstep this time, little brother?" he asked, though there was more concern than accusation in his tone. "The usual kind," Mason replied with a weak attempt at humor. "This is Zoe Hargrove. Zoe, my brother Michael." "Madam," Michael acknowledged with a nod. "Let's get you both inside. Mason looks about ready to fall off that horse." With Michael's help, they made it to the house. A woman emerged at their approach, slender, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her eyes widened at the sight of Mason. "Sarah, fetch the medicine box," Michael instructed. "Mason's been shot." "It's not as bad as it looks," Mason protested as they helped him dismount. "It never is with you," Michael replied dryly. Inside, the house was warm and inviting. Sarah, who Zoe learned was Michael's wife of 3 years, efficiently cleaned and bandaged Mason's wound while Zoe told their story. Michael listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When she finished, he shook his head slowly. "Pierce won't give up easily," he said, "not with his pride at stake, and now with his men dead." "He doesn't know where we are," Mason pointed out, wincing as Sarah tightened the bandage around his shoulder. "Maybe not yet," Michael agreed, "but he has resources, connections. It's only a matter of time before he traces you to Colorado." "What are you saying?" Zoe asked, fear creeping back into her voice. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances. "I'm saying you can't stay here long," Michael replied. "A few days to rest and recover, then you need to move on, further north maybe. Or west to California." The thought of more running, more danger, made Zoe's heart sink. She had hoped their ordeal was ending, not just pausing. Mason must have read her expression, for he reached out with his good arm and took her hand. "We'll figure it out," he promised quietly. "Together, remember?" Sarah cleared her throat. "You both look dead on your feet. Questions and plans can wait. There's a room upstairs made up. Zoe, you can take that one. Mason can have the spare room off the kitchen." "Thank you," Zoe said sincerely, "for everything." "Family helps family," Sarah replied with a warm smile, "and any woman who'd ride through the night with a wounded man to protect him is family in my book." The next few days passed in a blur of rest, recovery, and anxious planning. Mason's wound, while painful, was indeed not serious. The bullet had grazed his shoulder rather than penetrating deeply. By the 3rd day, he was up and about, though Sarah scolded him constantly for doing too much. Michael's ranch was larger than Zoe had initially realized, over 500 acres, with a growing herd of cattle and several fine horses. He employed 4 ranch hands who lived in a bunkhouse near the barn, all loyal men who asked no questions about the unexpected visitors. On the 4th morning, Zoe found Mason sitting on the porch, staring out at the mountains. She joined him, settling beside him on the bench. "Penny for your thoughts," she said softly. He smiled at her. "Was just thinking how beautiful it is here. Almost makes a man want to put down roots." "It is beautiful," Zoe agreed, following his gaze to the snow-capped peaks in the distance. "Your brother has built something wonderful," Mason nodded. "He always knew what he wanted, worked for it, didn't let anything stand in his way." "Like someone else I know," Zoe said, squeezing his hand. Mason's expression grew serious. "Zoe, we need to talk about what happens next." "I know," she sighed. "Michael thinks we should keep moving." "He's probably right," Mason admitted reluctantly. "Pierce isn't the type to give up, and now that his men are dead." "So we keep running," Zoe said, unable to keep the weariness from her voice. Mason turned to face her fully. "There's another option. Michael has a friend who operates a trading post up near the Canadian border. Remote, off the usual trails. We could go there, at least for a while. And then, Mason took a deep breath. Maybe we make a new start, together. If that's still what you want." Zoe studied his face, the face that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "It's what I want," she said firmly. "You and me, building something together. I don't care where." Relief and joy washed over Mason's features. "I was hoping you'd say that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. Michael's been keeping it for me. It's not fancy, but..." Zoe's heart swelled. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Zoe Hargrove," Mason said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner in whatever life brings us?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, Mason Quinn, I will." The kiss they shared was a promise of love, of commitment, of a future together regardless of the obstacles still before them. That evening, they shared their news with Michael and Sarah, who were delighted despite their concerns about the ongoing danger. We'll leave for the Northern Territories in a few days, Mason told his brother. But first, if you're willing, we'd like to be married, here, with you and Sarah as witnesses. Michael clapped his brother on his good shoulder. Nothing would make me prouder. 2 days later, in the simple front room of the Quinn Ranch, Zoe and Mason exchanged vows before Michael, Sarah, and a local preacher who asked no questions about the hasty ceremony. Zoe wore a dress borrowed from Sarah, altered quickly to fit her smaller frame. Mason wore clean clothes provided by his brother, his injured arm still in a sling but healing well. The words they spoke were traditional, but the love in their eyes as they promised themselves to each other was anything but ordinary. It was a love forged in danger and sacrifice, tested by fire and stronger for it. After the brief ceremony and a celebratory meal prepared by Sarah, the newlyweds found a moment alone on the porch as twilight settled over the valley. "Mrs. Quinn," Mason said softly, the name clearly pleasing him, "has a nice sound to it." "It does," Zoe agreed, leaning against him. "Though I never imagined I'd be a married woman on the run." Mason's arm tightened around her. "Not the easiest start for us, I'll admit, but we'll make it right. Build something good together." "We already have," Zoe said, turning to face him. "Something stronger than any ranch or homestead. Something Theodore Pierce and his money could never buy." As Mason's lips met hers in the gathering darkness, Zoe knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The journey from Hangtown had been fraught with danger, but it had led her to something precious beyond measure, a love freely given, freely returned, and worth any price. The next morning, Michael pulled Mason aside while Zoe and Sarah prepared provisions for the journey north. "Got something for you," Michael said, leading his brother to the barn. Inside, he pointed to a loaded wagon with a canvas cover. "Figured you'd need transportation that's less conspicuous than riding. 2 men on horseback might draw attention." Mason examined the sturdy farm wagon with appreciation. "This is perfect, Michael." "But I can't take your wagon." Michael waved away his protest. "Already replaced it. This one's yours. And there's more." He pulled back the canvas to reveal crates of supplies, food, ammunition, tools, even books. Sarah thought Zoe might like those, for when you settle somewhere. Overwhelmed, Mason embraced his brother with his good arm. "I don't know how to thank you." "Just live a good life," Michael replied, his voice gruff with emotion. "Be happy. That's all the thanks I need." "What about Pierce?" Mason asked. "If he traces us here." "Let me worry about Pierce," Michael said firmly. "I've got friends in Denver who can make inquiries, find out what he's planning. And if he shows up here." His hand rested meaningfully on his revolver. Mason nodded, grateful beyond words for his brother's support. "I'll find a way to repay you someday." Michael smiled. "You already have. Seeing you happy with a good woman by your side, that's payment enough." They departed at dawn the next day, the wagon loaded with supplies, a pair of steady draft horses in the harness. Sarah hugged Zoe tightly. "Take care of each other," she whispered, "and write when you can. We'll want to know you're safe." "We will," Zoe promised, blinking back tears. In just a few days, Sarah had become the sister she'd never had. Michael handed Mason a sealed envelope. "Some cash to get you started," he explained, "and directions to Jacob's trading post. Tell him I sent you. He's a good man. Will help you get settled." With final embraces and promises to reunite when it was safe, Mason and Zoe set off, the wagon rumbling down the trail that led north from the Quinn Ranch. "It's not going to be an easy journey," Mason warned as they left the valley behind. "Rough country ahead." Zoe's hand found his on the wagon seat. "I'm not afraid," she said. "Not anymore." The journey north was indeed challenging. They traveled slowly, avoiding main roads and settlements where news of a reward might have spread. The early autumn weather turned increasingly unpredictable as they moved into higher country, warm days giving way to frigid nights, occasional storms drenching them despite the canvas cover. Yet, despite the difficulties, Zoe found herself happier than she had ever been. Each night, as they made camp beside the wagon, she and Mason would talk for hours, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes for the future, their dreams for the home they would build together. "I've been thinking," Mason said one evening as they sat beside their small fire. "When we reach Jacob's trading post, maybe we don't just stay temporarily." Zoe looked up from the book she was reading, one of several Sarah had packed for her. "What do you mean?" "That country up north, it's wild, barely settled. But there's good land to be had. A man willing to work hard could build something there." Mason's eyes were alight with possibility. "We could stake a claim, start our own place, not just hiding out but making a real home." The idea took root in Zoe's heart immediately. "Our own homestead," she said softly, "where we could raise cattle, horses. Maybe children someday," Mason added, watching her face carefully. "If you wanted that." Zoe's heart swelled. "I do want that. Very much." They reached Jacob's trading post after 2 weeks of travel, a sturdy log building beside a fast-flowing river surrounded by towering pines. Jacob Redmond proved to be exactly as Michael had described him, gruff but kind, asking few questions but offering genuine hospitality. "Any brother of Michael Quinn is welcome here," he said, showing them to a small cabin behind the main building. "You can stay as long as needed." Over the next few weeks, Mason and Zoe learned the rhythms of their new surroundings. Jacob's trading post served a scattered community of trappers, a few homesteaders, and several Native American tribes who came to trade furs and hides for supplies. Mason quickly made himself useful, helping Jacob with repairs and taking over the care of the horses and mules used for transporting goods. Zoe, to her delight, discovered that Jacob's wife Emma had once been a schoolteacher in St. Louis. "We've got no formal school here," Emma explained, "but I try to teach the children when I can. Some from the homesteads, some from the friendly tribes. There's never enough time with all the work of the trading post." "I could help," Zoe offered eagerly. "Teaching is what I've always wanted to do." Emma's face lit up. "Would you? It would be such a blessing to have another educated woman here." Thus began a new chapter in their lives. By day, Zoe taught whatever children appeared at the trading post, using the book Sarah had given her and others from Emma's small collection. Mason worked with Jacob, learning the trading business and exploring the surrounding territory in search of the perfect spot for their own homestead. In the evenings, they would return to their small cabin, talking excitedly about their days, planning their future, and loving each other with an intensity that only grew stronger with time. Word came from Michael, periodically letters carried by traders or travelers heading north. Theodore Pierce had indeed traced them to Colorado, arriving at the Quinn Ranch with a small army of hired guns just 2 weeks after Mason and Zoe had departed. He threatened, blustered, even offered Michael money, Emma read aloud from the latest letter. But Michael stood firm, said he hadn't seen his brother in years. The local sheriff backed him up. "Seems Michael has more friends in the territory than Pierce expected." "Will he keep looking for us?" Zoe wondered, worry creasing her brow. "Michael doesn't think so," Mason said, scanning the rest of the letter. "Pierce lost a lot of money and face over this whole affair. His father is pressuring him to let it go, focus on their banking business." "Do you believe that?" Zoe asked, searching his face. Mason considered carefully. "I think the further away we are, the less likely he is to keep pursuing us. Out here, we're beyond his reach." As winter settled over the northern territories, Mason and Zoe found themselves truly at home in their new community. The trading post became a gathering place during the long, cold months, trappers and settlers coming together to share news, stories, and companionship. On Christmas Eve, as a blizzard howled outside, Jacob hosted a celebration in the main room of the trading post. Lanterns and candles cast a warm glow over the rough-hewn tables where 20 or so people gathered, a mix of traders, homesteaders, and even a few members of the local Blackfoot tribe who had good relations with Jacob. Zoe, her cheeks flushed with happiness, played carols on Jacob's battered piano while children sang along. Mason watched her from across the room, his heart full to bursting. In the soft light, with snow falling beyond the windows. He couldn't imagine a more perfect moment. Later that night, as they lay together in their small cabin, Zoe propped herself up on one elbow, studying Mason's face in the firelight. "I have something to tell you," she said, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. "What's that, Mrs. Quinn?" he asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Our family's going to grow," she said softly. "By next summer, there will be 3 of us." Mason stared at her, joy dawning slowly on his face. We're going to have a baby?" Zoe nodded, tears of happiness shimmering in her eyes. "Emma confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to wait until tonight to tell you. Merry Christmas, Mason." He pulled her to him, his kiss conveying all the emotions he couldn't put into words. When they finally broke apart, he placed his hand gently over her still flat stomach. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything. For taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing to offer but his heart." "It was the best decision I ever made," Zoe replied, placing her hand over his. "From the moment you said he could keep his money, I knew you were different from any man I'd ever met." Spring came late to the Northern Territories, but when it arrived, it brought rapid change. The snow melted, revealing a landscape transformed, wildflowers carpeting meadows, streams swollen with runoff, wildlife emerging from winter hideaways. Mason, with Jacob's guidance, had spent the winter months scouting locations for their homestead. In April, he took Zoe to see the spot he'd chosen, a fertile valley about 5 miles from the trading post, with a clear creek running through it, sheltered by gentle hills with timber for building close at hand. "What do you think?" he asked anxiously as they stood on a rise overlooking the valley. "Is it what you imagined?" Zoe, now visibly pregnant, surveyed the scene with shining eyes. "It's perfect, Mason. Absolutely perfect." With help from friends they'd made over the winter, fellow settlers, trappers, even members of the Blackfoot tribe who respected Jacob, construction on their home began. The work was hard but rewarding. And as the walls of their cabin rose log by log, so did their excitement for the future. By July, the cabin was habitable, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, the beginnings of a barn nearby. They moved in just in time, for on a warm night in early August, Zoe went into labor. Emma Redmond served as midwife, her steady presence a comfort through the long, difficult hours. Just as dawn broke, the lusty cry of a newborn filled the cabin. "A boy," Emma announced, placing the swaddled infant in Zoe's arms, strong and healthy. Mason, who had paced outside for most of the night, was called in. The sight of Zoe, exhausted but radiant, holding their son, brought him to his knees beside the bed. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "Just like his mother." "What shall we call him?" Zoe asked. Mason thought for a moment. "What about Michael, after my brother who helped make all this possible?" "Michael Quinn," Zoe tried the name out. "I like it. Michael Thomas Quinn, after your brother and my grandfather." "It's a good name," Mason agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "A name for a man who will grow up free, beholden to no one." As Emma slipped out to give the new family privacy, Mason settled on the edge of the bed, one arm around Zoe, the other gently supporting their son. "I never thought I could be this happy," he admitted. "Never thought I deserved it." "Of course you deserve it," Zoe said fiercely. "You're the best man I've ever known, Mason Quinn, and you're going to be a wonderful father." The months that followed were a blur of joy, exhaustion, and constant work. While Zoe recovered and cared for baby Michael, Mason continued building their homestead, completing the barn, constructing fences, preparing for the small herd of cattle and horses he planned to acquire the following spring. Word continued to come from Colorado. Theodore Pierce had indeed given up his pursuit, turning his attention to rebuilding his reputation in Hangtown. Zoe's father had died, found frozen one winter morning after a night of heavy drinking. "I should feel something," Zoe said when Mason shared the news. "But I don't. The man who raised me, who loved me in his way, died years ago. The man who sold me to settle a debt was a stranger." By the baby's first birthday, their homestead had grown substantially. They now had a small herd of cattle, 3 fine horses, and a vegetable garden that was the envy of nearby settlers. The cabin had been expanded to include a 3rd room, and Mason had built shelves to house Zoe's growing collection of books. Though she missed formal teaching, Zoe found fulfillment in the reading and arithmetic lessons she offered to neighboring children who would gather at their home once a week. Word of the educated woman in the valley spread, and soon adults began coming to trappers wanting to learn to read, settlers' wives eager for news and knowledge from the books Jacob ordered for Zoe whenever traders came through. On a warm evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching little Michael toddle after a butterfly, Mason slipped his arm around Zoe's shoulders. "Happy?" he asked. "Completely," she replied, leaning into him, "though I've been thinking." "Dangerous," Mason teased. "What's on your mind, Mrs. Quinn?" Zoe's eyes followed their son's determined exploration of the yard. "I was thinking Michael might like a brother or sister before too long. What do you think?" Mason's smile was answer enough. "I think that sounds like the best idea you've had since agreeing to marry me." The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Michael was joined by a sister, Emma Sarah, named for the 2 women who had become such important parts of their lives. 2 years later, another son, William, completed their family. Their homestead prospered. Mason's careful stewardship of the land and livestock paid dividends, while Zoe's unofficial school grew into a recognized institution with a proper building constructed by the community on the edge of their property. Occasionally, news would reach them from Hangtown. Theodore Pierce had eventually married the daughter of another banker, a loveless match by all accounts. The town itself had changed. The gold mostly played out, many miners moving on to new strikes, businesses closing or changing hands. "Do you ever miss it?" Mason asked Zoe one night as they read a letter from Sarah describing these changes. "The town where you grew up?" Zoe considered the question thoughtfully. "I miss certain people, Mr. Harrigan, who was kind to me, a few others. But Hangtown itself? No, it was never really home." "And this is?" Mason gestured to the comfortable room around them, the evidence of their shared life together. "This is," Zoe confirmed, setting aside the letter to take his hand. "Not just the place, but the life we've built, the family we've made." Mason pulled her close. "All because you were brave enough to ride away with a stranger in the middle of the night." "The best decision I ever made," Zoe said with a smile. "Though I don't think you were ever really a stranger, Mason Quinn. I think my heart knew you before my head did." 10 years after they had fled Hangtown, on a bright October day, a letter arrived from Michael in Colorado. He and Sarah, along with their 3 children, were planning to visit the following summer. "And there's more news," Zoe read aloud to Mason as they sat by the fire. "Franklin Pierce died last month. His bank failed after a series of bad investments, and Theodore lost everything. Apparently, he's left Hangtown, destination unknown." Mason was silent for a moment, absorbing this information. "Can't say I'm sorry about old Franklin," he finally said. "As for Theodore, I almost feel sorry for him." "Sorry?" Zoe asked, surprised. "After all he did?" Mason shrugged. "He lost everything he valued: money, position, respect. But then, he never understood what really matters anyway." His eyes met hers across the room, where she sat with their youngest child dozing in her lap. He never knew that some things can't be bought. Some things have to be earned or freely given. "Like love," Zoe said softly. "Like love," Mason agreed. "Like family. Like the life we've built here." As their children grew, the story of their parents' escape from Hangtown became a favorite bedtime tale appropriately edited for young ears. Michael, Emma, and William would listen wide-eyed as their father described the midnight flight, the pursuit through the mountains, the final confrontation. "And then what happened?" little Emma would always ask, though she knew the answer by heart. "Then we found this valley," Mason would reply, his arm around Zoe, "and we built a home, and we lived happily ever after." It wasn't the whole truth, of course. Real life was never as neat as a bedtime story. There had been hardships, harsh winters, illness, the constant work of building something from nothing. But the core of the tale was absolutely true. They had found each other, chosen each other, and built a life richer than anything Theodore Pierce could have purchased with all his money. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Zoe with a special gift, a silver locket containing tiny portraits of their 3 children, now growing into young adults themselves. Michael, at 19, was the spitting image of his father, already talking of exploring beyond the valley. Emma, 17, had her mother's intelligence and determination, with plans to attend a teacher's college in Denver. William, 15, was quieter than his siblings, but had a natural gift with animals that promised a future, continuing the family ranch. "It's beautiful," Zoe said, touching the locket reverently. "Perfect." "Not quite as perfect as you," Mason replied, the love in his eyes as strong as it had been that night by the fire when they'd first confessed their feelings. 20 years and I still can't believe my luck." "Not luck," Zoe corrected him gently. "Choice. We chose each other. We chose this life. And I'd choose it all again in a heartbeat." As they stood on the porch of the home they'd built, watching the sun set over their land, Zoe thought of the frightened young woman she'd been in Hangtown, the woman who had been sold to settle a debt. That woman seemed like someone from another lifetime now. Mason's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, echoing words they'd exchanged countless times over their years together. Zoe leaned against him, savoring the familiar strength and warmth of him. "I was thinking about worth," she said, "about value, about how Theodore Pierce thought he could buy me with money and position." Mason's arm tightened around her. "He never understood what you were really worth." "No," Zoe agreed, "but you did. From the very beginning. When you said he could keep his money." "Best declaration of my life," Mason said with a smile. "Though 'I do' comes in a close second." As twilight deepened around them and lights began to glow in the windows of their home, Zoe silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought Mason Quinn into her life that day in Hangtown. The banker's son had offered money, position, security, but Mason had offered something infinitely more valuable: choice, respect, and a love that had only grown stronger through the years. And in the end, that had made all the difference.